This PowerPoint is about behaviorism, which is the first learning theory we're going to talk about in educational psychology. This graphic shows the different learning theories that are the main theories of educational psychology, which we will be discussing in class this semester. As you have learned from the beginning of this PowerPoint, we are talking about behaviorism first. Behaviorism is the idea that in order to know someone has learned, you have to see a change in their behavior. This theory came about because prior to behaviorism, the mind was a black box and people just kind of talked about what they thought they were thinking about, which is not the most effective way to understand what someone learns. So behaviorism became the first scientific learning theory that said, no, we have to see a change in behavior to know that learning has occurred. We can't just rely on people to say, oh yeah, I learned that. So behaviorism says learning is an observable change in behavior. Some key terms you need to remember when you're thinking about and learning about behaviorism. The first is stimulus or stimuli, which is the plural of stimulus, which is anything that influences a behavior. So turning off the lights to get people to be quiet, turning off the lights is the stimulus. Turning off the lights to signal that it's time to eat is a stimulus. The response is any behavior that happens after the stimulus or happens in response to a stimulus. It's the specific behavior that occurs because of that. And then conditioning, which is the actual learning that takes place in behaviorism. It's the stimulus response process. So learning is the observable behavior that is exhibited because of a change in stimulus or a change in response. There are two categories within behaviorism. The first category is classical conditioning, and the second category is instrumental or operant conditioning. You'll see both of those terms. I like to use operant conditioning, but your textbook uses instrumental, so just know that those two are the same thing. Well, first we're going to talk about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning relies heavily on stimulus and response. It has a lot to do with whether there's a stimulus and a response present. It starts with an unconditioned stimulus, which is something that's meant to elicit behavior but is not associated with that behavior yet. That leads to an unconditioned response. For example, if you put food in front of a dog, that dog will salivate, not because of any learning, but it's just a natural response to food, to salivate. So that the food is an unconditioned stimulus and the salivating or the drooling is an unconditioned response. So with classical conditioning, we can use that unconditioned response and unconditioned stimulus to help us to shape or change someone's behavior. So we can use a neutral stimulus, something that wouldn't necessarily have a response to it, and pair it with an unconditioned stimulus to create a conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. So the neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response will become the conditioned response. For example, going back to our drooling dog, the unconditioned stimulus was food and the unconditioned response was drooling. But we can make a dog drool on command with a neutral stimulus. For example, a bell. If a dog heard a bell, it wouldn't necessarily start drooling. But if you pair the bell with the food, then the dog will associate the bell with food, which makes him drool. So then the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. So you could ring a bell and get the conditioned response, which would be drooling, which used to be the unconditioned response. Alright, so you might be thinking, okay, what does this have to do with education? Ringing a bell, presenting an Altoid. Well, not much actually. We don't really train our students in that way. But we do use operant conditioning sometimes as opposed to classical conditioning. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about what you think the difference is between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. All right, so the difference is that classical conditioning is an involuntary response. That unconditioned response is an involuntary. A person doesn't think about it, doesn't necessarily control it. Whereas operant conditioning has voluntary responses. You can think about and choose whether you want to use that stimulus to control your behavior. It's a voluntary response. The second way that the classical conditioning and operant conditioning are different is the order of the stimulus and response. In classical conditioning, as you've seen, the stimulus comes first and then the response happens. Whereas in operant conditioning, the response happens in order to get the stimulus, as we'll see in a moment. It has to do with reinforcement and punishment. So a person engages in a behavior to avoid punishment or to get a reinforcement. So some key stimuli or different stimulus are reinforcement and punishment. So a reinforcement is anything that encourages behavior, that it makes it more likely a behavior will occur again. Whereas a punishment is a stimulus that's presented to decrease behavior or increase the likelihood that a behavior won't be repeated. So we can think about reinforcement and punishment in different ways. First, if a stimulus is presented, if you're giving a reinforcement or giving a punishment. So if you want to encourage a behavior and you're presenting a reinforcement, that's called positive reinforcement. This is an example of giving a sticker for good behavior or giving a good grade in response to something. Whereas if you're presenting a punishment, that's called type 1 punishment or presentation punishment. This is where you're presenting a punishment in order to decrease behavior. So that would be presenting a student with detention if they get in trouble, or scolding a student if they get in trouble. You're giving a punishment. Sometimes the stimulus is removed in order to reinforce or punishment. So negative reinforcement is where you're trying to increase the behavior, encourage that behavior, so it's reinforcement, but you're removing something that is unappealing to a student. So if a student does well on their homework, you might reinforce that behavior by taking away the last 5 problems. You're removing something that they don't necessarily want. So type 2 punishment or removal punishment is where you want to suppress a behavior, you don't want it to repeat, but you remove something that a student would want. So you might start the day with a student has 5 points. Well, if they misbehave in some way, you take away a point. And the points then add up at the end of the day to get something. So you're taking away something they want. Timeout could also be considered a type 2 punishment. So there are different schedules of reinforcement or different ways in which you can reinforce, timing-wise. The first kind is continuous, where you're continuously giving some kind of reinforcement. Every single time someone does something, you're giving some kind of reinforcement. A student raises their hand. Every time you say, "Thank you for raising your hand. Great job for raising your hand," which can get a little old, right, in a classroom of continuously giving reinforcement. Every time giving a sticker, it will wear off quickly on you, and then it'll wear off for being effective on the students. So a better way is to have an intermittent schedule where it doesn't happen all the time. It happens at separate times. So within intermittent, there are 2 kinds. The first is interval, and the second is ratio. So interval is at a certain time or at time intervals, and ratio is in comparison to how many times that behavior has happened. So interval has fixed and variable times. Fixed times would be every 5 minutes you would reward a student if they were on task or doing the behavior that you desire. Whereas variable would be you have different times, random times. So it might be 5 minutes, it might be 2 minutes, it might be 10 minutes. So it's not a set schedule, it's mixed up, but it's still a time interval. Ratio also has fixed and variable. So fixed would be every 5th time a student does the behavior, you reward that student. Every 5th time they sit in their seat, you're going to reward that behavior. Whereas variable would be random again. It's not necessarily every 5th time. It might be 2, 5, 10. Which one do you think is the most effective out of continuous or intermittent? It would be intermittent, right? Because continuous, if you're always being praised or always getting something, it's going to wear off. So it's not as effective. Out of fixed or variable, either interval or ratio, which one do you think is the most effective, fixed or variable? It would be variable, right? Fixed, a student could figure it out. So every 5th time, I'm just going to do it. Or every 5 minutes, I'm going to make sure I'm doing the behavior I know is needed to get the reinforcement. But variable, you always have to be on your game because you don't know when that reinforcement is going to come. That's why gambling is so effective, because it's a variable schedule of reinforcement.